Hello everybody, my name is Brady and we are back with another React video, and today we're going to be continuing the extra history series on Admiral Yi. More like Admiral Yeet. Am I right, guys? Fellow kids? Alright, now that I got that demographic, we can continue with the video. I really enjoyed the last one, although it was a bit fast. It was a little repetitive, but I think it does lay out kind of the slog that Yi's early career was. So that in itself was pretty effective, so I like that. I'm very happy that we're going to get into the Sengoku Jidai crossover stuff. That's why I got into this series to begin with, so let's do it. I'm very excited to get started.
At last, we've passed the phase of Yi's life where his every effort is thwarted by the machinations of corrupt officials and jealous superiors. Finally, we can begin the story that sees Yi rise to be the national hero of Korea. But first, we have to talk about the two contrasting states that are about to meet in bloody battle. If you watched the Sengoku Jidai episodes, you'll remember that Japan had just come out of 100 years of ceaseless war. Their entire society was built off of a martial hierarchy, where the most glorious thing a man could do was fight. Japan had fielded giant armies and had an economy devoted to war. They had hundreds of thousands of veteran soldiers, and they had seasoned generals, battle-hardened from years of...
So, yeah, they have all that. One thing that I don't think I got enough idea of during the Sengoku Jidai stuff was the power of Japanese naval forces. I feel like I didn't really get a full grasp of that, because that would be a very different experience from what I got to see a lot of in the Sengoku Jidai stuff. They're fighting their neighbors, people who are on the same landmass. There is an inherent challenge in crossing water and getting into somebody else's territory. It's really interesting, but also I would imagine their navy would be decently powerful because they are an island nation, because there is so much water surrounding them. It seems like inherently they would have to have like a decent naval presence, but if they're so used to fighting each other, how often do they get to use it?
Of campaigning. And now, for the first time ever, all those forces were unified under one man, Toyotomi Hideyoshi. The Korean state had, by contrast, been mostly at peace for 200 years. The state itself was a Confucian bureaucracy, which should have meant that it was an enlightened meritocracy, but in truth, the Korean government was rotten to its core, full of factional infighting and led by a king who perhaps might have been a great leader in times of peace, but was utterly unsuited for a state of war.
That's how it be. It be that way sometimes. I love judging people's legacies and kind of playing the what-if game, like presidents during times of war. Imagine what they would be like in times of peace and otherwise. There's like people like Lincoln. What would we think about Lincoln if his entire presidency was peaceful? It might be a completely different assessment. Right now he's like on the top echelon of respected presidents, it might be totally different if it was during times of peace. And then we have guys like James Madison, and he was kind of embarrassed during the War of 1812. Maybe he would have been a better peace president. But, you know, there are also other problems with that. But that's a completely unrelated conversation. But I love playing around with that stuff.
In terms of military thinking, the Japanese had spent years perfecting the art of war. The daimyos had become early adopters of the arquebus and had rapidly innovated on firearm manufacturing and tactics. They had created movable field works to protect their gunners, coordinated the use of spears and arquebusiers, drilled the men to release large, simultaneous volleys to break up a charge, and trained them to wait to fire until they were within an effective range. They were such enthusiastic adopters of the arquebus that when the Japanese eventually arrived on Korean shores, about a quarter of their total force would be armed with this fearsome weapon. The Japanese had also become masters of the siege after so many decades.
They also have gun monks, so I have heard.
Of having to topple the highly wrought, master-crafted Japanese castles of the Sengoku age. The Koreans, on the other hand, had largely ignored the introduction of personal firearms and still relied mainly on the bow. But because the bow is a weapon that requires a great deal of training, and the Korean military was in a dissipated state, the actual number of effective troops they could field with this weapon was now very limited. The lists of who they could call to military service were all out of date, and so the initial mustering of forces would lag behind, and Korean defensive works were mostly just simple stone walls atop hills or mountains. But the Koreans did have two advantages. Since the war that had been burning through Japan for the last 100 years was a civil war, and thus mostly land-based, Japan hadn't built up its navy nearly as much as their other armed forces.
Okay, that was what I was saying earlier. I wasn't sure about that. That seemed like it would be one of their weaknesses, since they were all kind of fighting each other. They have that sort of isolation where they're less likely to be attacked because it's kind of a pain for that, but they would end up fighting among each other. Therefore, why would they need a navy if they're not being attacked as much from the outside, but from within? Okay, like, I'm glad they're addressing that.
Additionally, while Japan produced vastly superior handguns, the Koreans had developed better naval cannon. And this all makes sense when you think about what both of these forces were used to facing. Japanese forces were used to fighting large, organized land armies, and so they'd focused on developing the weapons and techniques required to counter them. Whereas Korea had mostly dealt with pirates and raiders, so they built cannon to help defend their coast, and they built simple hill forts so that when raiders showed up, the people could hide in the forts and simply wait for the raiders to go away. They didn't need complex structures because the enemy Korea usually faced wasn't an enemy bent on conquest. But that was about to change. Between 1587 and 1592, emissaries raced back and forth between Japan and Korea. Hideyoshi wanted the Koreans to just let him march his armies through their lands in order to attack his intended target, China. But besides the fact that letting giant foreign armies march across your country is generally a bad idea, the Koreans also happened to be tributary allies of the Chinese with strong cultural and economic ties, so letting this army march through uncontested was out of the question. This whole thing seemed like madness to them. The idea that the Japanese would even ask for such a thing was unfathomable to many in court. At first, they assumed the request must be a bluff, maybe a negotiating tactic that would eventually end in the Japanese asking for trade concessions or tribute or something. But Ryu Sung-young saw...
I mean, they've just went through this huge war, and, like, now that they're out on top and more united than ever, maybe they're feeling a bit arrogant, like nothing can really stop them. I'd imagine there is a degree of arrogance that is coming in, like the biggest enemies are behind them, and if they know anything about Korea, they might underestimate them. Though at the beginning of this, when they first introduced this, I was thinking, oh, Japan's gonna, like, destroy them. But well, I know what I do from the Sengoku Jidai stuff, but, like, pretending I didn't know that stuff, this is going to be a heavily naval battle, one would assume.
Further to what was really about to go down. And so he got Yi a naval appointment in the southwestern part of Korea and helped to make sure that he rose rapidly through the ranks, becoming the naval commander for the province by 1591. This is where Yi's story really begins. Upon taking command, Yi saw the dire straits the Navy was in and knew he had little time. He began drilling his men and instilling in them the spirit they needed for the war to come. He commissioned a new type of ship, the famous turtle ship, which he helped design. It was a remarkable piece of naval technology, with a spiked roof to keep enemy boarding parties out and a dragon head prow that could serve as a cannon or billow out noxious smoke. But even before the first of these ships could see active service, it happened. Sentries all...
Can I just see that? That doesn't feel real. Like, clearly it's really a thing, but it doesn't feel real.
Parties out, and a dragon head prow that could serve as a cannon or billow out noxious smoke. But even before the first of these ships could see active service, it happened. Sentries all across the southeast coast began to spot ships coming over the horizon. Then tens of ships. Then hundreds. This massive fleet flew no sails known to Korean arms. Fires were lit, and word was spread. The Japanese were coming. But the local commanders refused to believe what they were seeing. They suggested that maybe it was a trade fleet, or maybe even a large tribute mission from the Japanese to apologize for how rude their ambassadors had been. And so, the local commanders did nothing. The approaching ships began to dock at Busan. Soldiers, fully armored and prepared for war, began to disembark from the ships, and still the local commanders did nothing. By nightfall, 300 ships full of warriors had landed. A Japanese army was now in Korea.
So it's... I mean, when you have the naval advantage, you have that... Once you let them all land, you've kind of lost that. Oh, it reminds me of like the Seinfeld bit where he's like, the door must be closed. Like, it's that's the one thing you had, and like, if you don't use it right, then it doesn't even serve that function, man. Like, I get why they might doubt a full-on military conflict from them. Maybe at this point they'd be able to perhaps think that they could, like, okay, we make the little concession, we let them march through our land, but I think once they've gotten this far, I think it's a little too late for that.
Finally, the commanders realized what had just happened, but by now it was far too late. With well over 100 heavy Korean ships of war at the ready, they had just sat and watched this happen without even moving a single one of those ships out to scout the fleet.
Dude.
If they had, they would have found out that this was a Japanese commander acting against orders. Eager to be the first to Korea, he had sailed his fleet before their warship arrived. Turns out nearly all of those hundreds of ships were unarmed transports. No match for the Korean Navy, which still sat anchored at port doing nothing. The Japanese force...
Dude, that would have been devastating. That would be historic if they just, like, wrecked all of those unarmed ships. Oh, God. Like, in a sense, I'm glad that they didn't, because that would have been a very tragic, sort of like a massacre type thing. But also, like, you're sailing up on a sovereign nation. So, like, what do you want to happen?
Moved like lightning, smashing army after army, crushing all in their way. Within the month, the Japanese were already in Seoul, 200 miles inland. Korean resistance had collapsed. And as the Japanese had pushed inland and moved out of Busan, the local commanders had scuttled their fleets. 100 Korean warships lost without a fight. But Busan's local commanders had sent word to Yi, asking for his help. So Yi set out with all 24 ships under his command, writing to other local commanders and telling them to rendezvous with him at sea. He left under cover of darkness and sailed through the night so his movements wouldn't be observed. By the time the various fleets met, they'd scraped together 45 warships and a handful of commandeered fishing ships. But Yi, despite never having commanded a battle at sea before, had a plan. He would fall on the Japanese while they were in harbor during the chaos of a sack. He found 50 of their vessels tied up at Okpo and descended upon them. The Japanese were mostly away from their ships at the time, looting and slaughtering the population. The roar of cannon alerted them to their mistake. Yi and his fleet tore...
Come on. No, we're not doing this. We're not doing this today. The baby's feeling... he's feeling hormonal right now. That was a bit of a distraction.
And descended upon them.
Go back.
The Japanese were a plan. He would fall on the Japanese while they were in harbor during the chaos of a sack. He found 50 of their vessels tied up at Okpo and descended upon them. The Japanese were mostly away from their ships at the time, looting and slaughtering the population. The roar of cannon alerted them to their mistake. Yi and his fleet tore through the enemy ships, salvo after salvo ripping into the light wood of the Japanese vessels. The Japanese tried to mount a defense, but to no avail. Soon, their men were throwing their weapons and armor overboard and trying to swim for the shore. By nightfall, 26 Japanese ships rested at the bottom of the harbor. Only one Korean sailor was injured. Yi decided to disappear back into open water before his forces fell into the same trap he'd just sprung on his enemy. But as they sailed, one of his outlying ships spotted 5 more Japanese warships. Yi fell upon them with a vengeance. Only one managed to escape. Then...
So, like, as far as naval forces go, it makes me wonder, like, this is already an outstanding performance from Yi. It makes me wonder, like, there's always, like, internal politics within a military organization, and it makes me kind of wonder where he's going to fall among other naval commanders. They've already talked about how... Korea did have like a decent naval presence, and it's making me wonder, like, he's going to eventually kind of be like a top tier guy. You guys have already kind of foreshadowed that in the comments and stuff. I'm just curious to where he will stand, like, after like this initial part. Like, how much does it take to be the top of the Korean Navy?
And new reports came in of 13 more ships near Chinhae. When the sailors on those ships saw Yi, they abandoned their vessels entirely and fled on foot into the mountains. 43 Japanese ships sunk, and Yi had not lost a single vessel. He was promoted to General Command of the Southern Navy for his actions, but the sight of Japanese slaughtering civilians would stick with him forever, and harden his resolve to defend the people of Korea. Join us next time as everyone else in Korea keeps losing, and Admiral Yi keeps winning.
I like the theme. So this one, like when you get into like the military stuff, you will find that I will kind of start to struggle a little bit to follow it, because military stuff has never really been my thing, but I really do enjoy it. When it's explained in a way that somebody like me can understand. Like I definitely have some limitations when it comes to that stuff. But I think Yi, I appreciate him as kind of like this unstoppable Chad monster dude who like just gets what he wants. I feel like I haven't gotten to like appreciate him as a human being yet. And that's what I'm hoping to get in like the future episodes of this. That's kind of one of the big things about it. Like, you can give me his military accomplishments, and like, I do really want to know his overall significance and like in the region at the time. But I kind of want to learn to appreciate him a little bit more as a human being as well. And I feel like I've gotten some admirable factors. He's very like, you knock him down, he gets back up again. That's an incredible personality trait. I don't know, how resourceful he is, how persistent he is. I really appreciate that. I think I want a little bit more though. Well, but I guess we'll see where we go with that stuff, because right now he's just a beast. And I need something a little bit more than just a beast. Or at least I hope to find that later in this series. But we'll see how it goes. Thank you guys for watching, and I will see you tomorrow. Maybe with another one of these, maybe with something else. I don't know. All right, later. Bye.